welcome to Simcast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging Informatics and Medicine. Greetings, Simcasters. Alok here. The nature of an imaging informaticist's work is by definition dynamic and interdisciplinary, requiring expertise across a broad set of domains. As I progressed through my radiology training, I was deeply entrenched in the clinical world and saw my fund of medical knowledge grow steadily over the years, only to be truly humbled during my first foray into imaging informatics with a new set of terminology and principles. In this episode, hosts Prasanth and Jason will speak with Professor Bill Auffermann, primary author of the first chapter in the upcoming second edition of Practical Imaging Informatics. Dr. Auffermann is an associate professor of radiology and imaging sciences at the University of Utah School of Medicine. Drawing on his background in the physical sciences, Dr. Auffermann discusses the strategies he used in composing the chapter in hopes of bringing together an audience across a wide range of expertise. He also speaks on how this chapter fits into the revised organization and flow of the new edition. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome, everybody. So, Bill, you've gotten to write the first chapter of the new Practical Imaging Informatics book. What can you tell us about the details and the type of contents that you had covered in this chapter?
Okay, so the chapter is basically intended to provide an introduction to medical imaging for people who are not as familiar with medical imaging. So when we were discussing this book, we had several introductory chapters planned, including for physicians who might not be as familiar with the IT side of things and for the informaticist who might not be as familiar with the medical aspects. And so this first chapter was really intended to describe the importance of imaging in medicine. And also, one thing that I've personally noticed that I think is very helpful for informaticists to understand is that medicine, there's a sense of urgency that's not always readily apparent. And part of the chapter was to really impress that very often in medicine, there is an urgency that one might not necessarily recognize, from a small segment of information presented about the patient.
Thank you very much for that. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of, they call it the curse of knowledge. So sometimes you're so well acquainted with a topic, it's challenging to explain it in a way that can be understood for lay people. I'm curious, as a subject matter expert in this area, did you find it a challenge to structure the content in a way that was introductory for learners?
Okay, so I know it's fun you say the curse of knowledge. I don't know if it's a good or bad thing that I had an easier time writing the chapter than. No, so I remember when I was the chemistry major as an undergraduate, and when I first started medical school, I myself, had some difficulty, fully understanding with limited bits of information, the sense of urgency. And so, like one of the examples that I discussed, I'm not going to go through the whole example now, was that, very often what the patients encounter at a hospital, it can have many aspects. They drive in, they can't find parking, they try to check in at the desk, there's a waiting line. So there are many, many things that happen just rather than the imaging encounter. And delays can happen and often do happen at multiple of those steps. And so somebody calls up, CT's been on the list for 5 minutes and they want to read right now, and you're thinking, wow, what's the hurry? But you don't realize all the steps in advance that the patient's actually been there for 4 hours, getting delayed at various parts of their encounter, trying to get this CT done. And now they're late for a bus ride back or getting back home. And they want the information right away. So I know that from my own personal experience, I remember learning about the importance of understanding the sense of clinical urgency. And I was able to draw on that when writing these chapters. And also I know interacting with informaticians, both, nationally and in our own institution. I know sometimes I find I need to kind of explain why something's important because it might not be readily apparent.
Yeah, one of the things that was stressed in my fellowship, informatics fellowship, was that we're the communication bridge between the clinical need and the IT side of things. I know you're also a board certified in clinical informatics. Other areas that you've learned through the clinical informatics side that show this, disparate information or, lack of urgency or decreased knowledge on the part of parties within the system?
Yeah, so I'd say the biggest thing is medicine has become so compartmentalized and siloed that I think it's very difficult for anyone to have the big picture understanding of what's happening with the patient anymore, and or at least is more challenging. And so I'd say that this pervades probably most aspects of medicine and informatics and isn't really relegated to any one specific area.
In medical school, they kept on talking about like the primary care is the gatekeeper and the person that is supposed to see the big picture and pull it all together. But you're right. It's becoming more and more difficult. And as we move into more precision medicine, there's more data. It's going to be more difficult to hold on to everything and be able to provide good care in a timely fashion.
Yeah, and that's the goal of informatics, is to try to take all this big, huge body of information and try to condense it down to something that's more digestible and meaningful and provides a large amount of useful information regarding the patient in a fairly concise period of time.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. So I'm thinking of the different types of, I guess, costumes or looks that an IIP may have. There's radiologists, non-rad physicians, technologists, people on the PACS team. When you were writing this chapter, did you have a specific type of role in mind, or were you thinking of this from a broad perspective?
I was thinking more of a broad perspective. So when we sat down and discussed how we were going to write the book, there were various introductory chapters. And they basically said, we want to write this book so that someone who does not have exposure in one of the areas here can still find the book useful. And so kind of the informatics sections were written with the non-informaticist in mind, someone who might be more clinically adept but not have the informatics skills. And the chapter that I wrote was intended for people who might have less exposure to clinical medicine. And so we really didn't as much have one particular group of individuals in mind, but rather, yes, just generally someone who was less familiar with clinical medicine.
Might you consider maybe in further editions having more information about the non-clinical side? I know in daily practice, things happen in the IT world and the radiologists have no idea that this is going on in the background. Servers go down, an interface, something happens to it, so on and so forth. So, like you talk about the IIP, not necessarily knowing the clinical urgency, but also you could mirror that onto the technological urgency, if you will, or lack of knowledge of what's going on in the background. Is there any thought in the next round to maybe add more of that in the first chapter or maybe later on in the book?
Well, my chapter was focused more on the clinical aspects, and I know there were a few other chapters that were focused on the introductory aspects of the informatics. And so I have not been as involved in terms of the nitty-gritty of the content of those chapters. So I know the table of contents. We briefly discussed some of the topics we wanted to discuss in those chapters. So I honestly have to say I'm not as aware of what's present in those chapters in terms of details, but I agree. I think that would actually be a very helpful thing to understand, because I know from my own experience, working in both informatics and clinical medicine, there are times I'll ask a clinician a question, what can we do to help? What can we do to change, make things better? And I'll get a response that's basically not possible by any means of computing that is currently known. And so it does definitely go both ways. And I think you're right. That would definitely be a very useful addition, if it's not already present in this edition, to future editions of this book.
What are some key points of this chapter that you want the readers to walk away with the most amount of understanding?
I think just generally that medicine is very complicated, and there can be things that happen that are not related at all to the work what someone is particularly doing, but will affect the need to get things done expeditiously at that step. So, for example, like I said, a patient comes in for their appointment, they can't find a parking spot. They finally get in, there's a line at the desk to check in, then they find out there's a problem with their insurance, they get that resolved. And then, because they were running a little late, that their provider saw somebody else before them and now they're waiting in the room, then they finally get into the room and there's a problem with the electronic medical record. And, by the time they end up getting to radiology, they could have been delayed for a fairly long period of time. And the people involved in imaging don't understand that. And they might not understand, like, we need this right away. And so I think just, an understanding that a lot of things happen in healthcare, and, just one might not necessarily always understand the sense of urgency, but it's important to understand that there could be things happening that one's not aware of. And so it's still important to take those seriously. And, interesting, like you said yourself, that I don't specifically talk about it, but you could translate that the other way as well, towards the IT side, that there's an issue with the packs and people are really trying to get it done very quickly. They've been working on it for a while, and that might not be understood on the part of the radiologist or the imager who just wants to get stuff done as fast as possible.
That's interesting because I was involved in one of the chapters. It was on the operational side, availability and notification. As I was reading your kind of component about how one change here, one impact here can have many, cascading impacts. And it was interesting kind of pairing that with on that operational side and thinking about when you send out notifications and making sure that it is going to go to all the appropriate stakeholders and resources that are notified appropriately. So yeah, there definitely are a lot of key components that in lots of different areas that are impacted in healthcare. You've touched on it a bit about that primacy of patient care. And in the chapter, you went and discussed this, the primacy of patient care and how this can be a difficult concept. Could you describe this to the audience a bit more? And we could go kind of see why is that a little harder for people to wrap their head around when they're coming not from a healthcare background?
Yes. So primacy of patient care, and there's no exact definition I've seen, but it's basically that patient care is prioritized over many other interests, including those of the people providing the patient care. And so I know I have a friend who's an attorney. We've talked about this a little bit. He does contract work, and somebody comes in and says, "Hey, I need someone to take a quick look at this contract for me." He goes, "Oh, well, we're busy. We'll get to it in 2 weeks." "Well, I really need this done really quickly." "Great. We'll get to it in 2 weeks." "And when do you get to this as fast as you can?" "Yep, we'll get to it in 2 weeks." And so there's no urgency. No one's really going to be seriously injured in many of those types of encounters. Whereas for patient care, if somebody comes in and they're having a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, they could die in hours if they don't receive care expeditiously, regardless of how busy one is or what your current schedule looks like. You need to make room for these emergencies. Many people have watched television programs in medicine. So it's one thing to see that and kind of know that from a theoretical perspective. It's another thing to experience it from that personal perspective. Well, I need to drop what I'm doing and get on this right away because this is important. Like I said, my background was in the physical sciences. And even though I recognized this going into medicine, it took a little bit of getting used to. Sometimes you just need to drop everything and deal with an emergency. And that's not something that people working in many other fields have to deal with routinely.
And some of this is just not even like emergency medicine or inpatient medicine, but even outpatient medicine too. Like somebody could show up at their doc and then they realize the person's actually having a heart attack and then everything becomes emergency. Or someone's coming in from a long distance away and, you want to get them in sooner rather than later for whatever consult or imaging, whatnot. And it's not quote unquote emergency, but you need to do this sooner rather than later. And they are physically present. So that it definitely makes things a little bit more difficult. I wanted to kind of move a little bit away from the content of the chapter and talk to you a little bit about your process for actually writing the chapter. Writing a book chapter is a little different than, say, writing a journal article or some other publication, right? Can you tell us a little bit about how you approach this? Some people outline, some people don't. Like, what was your methodology in writing this chapter up?
Okay, so generally speaking, and this is the way I approach writing, and everyone has their own way of doing things, and that's great. But personally, the way I tend to approach writing is that I kind of start with an outline. What do I want to talk about? Try to say the topics, logical organization, A, then B, then C, and fill that in and get more and more comprehensive in that outline. And then by the time I really have a very comprehensive outline, it's a matter of just stringing these various facts and arguments together with verbiage to form a paragraph and full chapter. And personally, that works very well for me because it makes things very easy to change and move around and kind of get an organizational structure without really having the verbiage that it's confusing. So that's my personal approach, but there are lots of approaches out there and I don't want to dissuade anyone from using theirs, but I find that works very well for me.
Yeah. How many meetings did you have with Char Brandsetter and the other authors? How much say did they have or sway, if you will, into your chapter? Or did they just say, we need an introductory chapter, have fun?
Yes, well, we spend a lot of time just really laying out the organization of the second edition and discussing, generally speaking, which topics we wanted in each chapter. And so once we kind of decided what we wanted in each chapter, I asked for clarification and just said, okay, I'm thinking these would be some good topics to include in this first chapter. Does this sound reasonable? And they thought it sounded reasonable. And so I'd say that most of the work in terms of organization, deciding what was going to be in each chapter, was done way up at the front end. We had the ability to develop the chapters based off that information. And I'd say that the final editing process of the chapters, at least to my knowledge, didn't change too much, given we had a fairly good understanding of what was expected for each chapter going into it.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. And I was curious, as I was reading this, one of the hypothetical scenarios was an orders-based imaging workflow within radiology. And curious if you were interested or if the thought had ever been discussed about covering an encounter-based imaging workflow with visible light imaging or whatnot.
Okay. When we were doing this, we really didn't get into the differences of discussing visible light versus radiologic imaging, because I think that many of the challenges and issues would be very similar for each. And I really struggled to think of a very unique aspect where one would be different from the other. But that's a very good point, as visible light imaging continues to play a more important role in medicine and forms a larger volume of the total image space on PACS. For the next edition, I dare say something we'd very much probably want to consider is the inclusion of other forms of imaging rather than just, conventional radiologic imaging.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking your time. Before we close, any final thoughts that you want to leave us with?
The main goal of the chapter was to really try to get people who might not be as familiar with clinical medicine, up to speed so they can kind of understand the motivation for imaging informatics. There's an important reason for that. And just to make that reason apparent, when you know what the goal is, it's really a lot easier to work towards that goal as opposed to not knowing what the goal is.
Simcast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics in Medicine. Please visit our website at siim.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at sim_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.